Okay, so I'm just going to mute people in the background because I am hearing the echo. So I'm trying to remember, have I shared this piece of art with you before? Have you seen it before? Now I'm not hearing anyone.
No, no,
No.
no.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So let me tell you about what I intend to do with you today, and also why I chose this piece of art to introduce the topic. So I am going to speak a fair bit about what's happening in the world, as I've been doing with you for several weeks now. Right, moving back and forth between the urgent news of the day and what I think of as the more slow boiling but urgent news of our era, some of which concerns technology and particularly the revolution in artificial intelligence. And so I want to speak with you today about that revolution and then about the different kinds of intelligence that people who work in artificial intelligence differentiate. And so the idea that we have generative artificial intelligence. It doesn't just spit back at us what it is that we have already put into it. It actually generates new ideas. That we may soon have general artificial intelligence. Right now, the term that's sometimes used is we have jagged or spiky artificial intelligence. It's really good at some things and quite awful at other things. And it's quite comical sometimes how something so incredibly powerful can also be so stupid. But when we get to the level of general intelligence, it will be equally good at everything that we're good at, and maybe quite a bit better at some of the stuff we're not very good at all. Agentic artificial intelligence that actually does things in the world, like coding, like making new computer platforms, which AI is now clearly better than we are at, or reading right medical diagrams, and the degree to which that involves interacting with the world and agency is a mixed bag, but generally speaking, more people are letting more artificial intelligence do more things. Super artificial artificial intelligence that actually exceeds human beings in almost every range of intelligence that human beings are equipped with, and then right strong intelligence, and the idea that strong intelligence refers to all the forms of intelligence. We had this discussion a little bit last week, and then before that, several weeks ago, that, for instance, right now, I don't think we think that artificial intelligence has anything but a simulacrum, a copy, a parrot's ability with emotional intelligence. It's not actually experiencing feelings or emotions, even though it has a tremendous mastery of the language that we use, the emotional vocabulary of poetry and music and love letters and novels, and so that it's often very good at producing convincing semblance of the kind of language and vocabulary we use to describe our emotions. It's not feeling the emotion. It doesn't know what the concept that it's employing is really about. It doesn't have what's sometimes called the qualitative correlate or the qualia of the experience. And so I want to continue pushing on this, in part because this has been actually a really important week in the development of technology. And so my claim about this is that there is something about the need to focus on artificial intelligence in a sustained way, is that there's something epoch shaping in the developments in machine learning and intelligence in the 21st century. It really is going to fundamentally shape the course of human history for as long as that history continues from the present ad infinitum, let us hope. And so the idea that, on the other hand, this appears to be kind of pushed to the background of our attention, of our focus, given everything else that's happening in the world, and that we would be well served, given the way in which these developments are going to structure everything that we do going forward, that we should pull it into the foreground and think about it a little bit more in a sustained way. So with that in mind, I'm seeing Peter's comment. Yes, one of the pieces of news this week is that an autonomous robot finished a half marathon, breaking the human time record. And in a sense, I don't think we should be surprised that if a robot can run half a marathon, that it can do it faster than a human being can, right? I mean, the limits on our capacity to run the half marathon have to do with our cardiovascular system, with our knees, and the knees we have are kind of built for animals that climb trees and sit on their haunches and drag their knuckles, not for creatures that try to run 14 miles upright. And so it's, I think, unsurprising. What I think may be more surprising is that robots can run at all, or that robots can dance, or that robots can do gymnastics, right? Or we could keep going. But yes, robotics is advancing very quickly, and we should expect, right, that robots will continue to exceed us. So I asked about the piece of art. You haven't seen it. Let me tell you about it for two reasons. So first, let me tell you about the artist, Wilfredo Lam. So this is a man who just had a major retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, which is where I encountered his work. And he's a fascinating man, and fascinating in part. He's Cuban and Chinese, one parent from each culture, and is someone in particular who is deeply steeped in Cuban or Afro-Cuban culture, but who was actually a member of the European avant-garde for most of his life. So he's born in the 1910s, early 20th century, sorry. Um, and by the time he gets to be a young man, he gets a scholarship. He goes to Spain. He's working there, getting trained in Spanish avant-garde art. And then Franco takes over. And so he actually fights on the side of the Spanish Republicans, who they obviously lose. And he is therefore in great danger of a wanted man. And as a kind of fugitive, he leaves for Paris, where he falls in with the Parisian avant-garde. He's quite friendly with Picasso. It's interesting to me. There's a large-scale painting by Wilfredo Lam of the Spanish Civil War that has many echoes of Picasso's Guernica in it. And it's interesting to me that, as far as I can tell, the two painters painted these paintings with absolutely no knowledge of the other's undertakings. So Lam goes to France, goes to Paris, but then, of course, the Nazis take over Paris. He flees to Marseille. Eventually, he returns to Cuba. He leaves Cuba and goes to Italy when Batista takes over in Cuba. And so I say this because one of the things I was thinking about as I was learning about his life and looking at his art is what it was like to live in the middle of the 20th century if you were not fortunate enough to be in a country that was basically stable in the way the United States was, but in the way that many of the countries I think we compare ourselves with were not, right? And how, right, again and again and again, Lamb became a kind of fugitive with the rise of authoritarianism, fascism in many of the places he lived, and whether or not the relative stability of the post-Cold War is something that we take for granted and tend to therefore pay less attention to what perhaps is a more normal epoch in human history, the period of the middle 20th century where there was just ongoing political instability. And that's a segue into what I want to say to you today about what's happening with the war with Iran and with economic instability. But before that, a little bit about the specific painting, right? And so the painting is called Body and Soul. And I'm not sure, I hope you can make it out, but it has, if you will, two representations of what appears to be human bodies, right? Abstracted and stretched and treated in a kind of cubist fashion, but one in a relatively white color, one in grays and blacks and browns. And they do seem to echo each other, and they do seem to be intertwined with each other. And it raises the question, which is body and which is soul? Or how do we demarcate the right border between what is material and what is spiritual in the human being? And by spiritual, I don't necessarily mean something as metaphysically laden as soul. You don't have to believe in the presence of an eternal soul that eventually is judged by God to believe that there is something in the nature of human beings that exceeds or transcends or emerges from, but is not reducible to the physical instantiation of us or the inherited evolutionary inclinations and instincts of the human being. Many of us seem to feel that we have something akin to free will. Many of us seem to think that we have the capacity to choose who we will love. And right, I refer to love again with the idea that there is something distinctly human and not merely biological in the way that we relate to the people that we choose to spend our lives with, build our lives with, integrate our lives with. And I'll say very quickly, right, the concept of romantic love is not one that has been with the human species since its inception. One of the things that seems to mark us in the way that a strand of German philosophy called it, as species beings, as beings whose core essence or nature evolves over time as the species evolve. We have different concepts of love, and perhaps the concept of love that we have in the 20th and 21st centuries is fundamentally different from earlier concepts of love that marks us as having aspects of our nature that don't just reduce to our biology, but how do we make sense of them, right? Is the soul the white and the body the dark, or vice versa? How are they related? How do they influence each other? This is some of what I think the revolution in artificial intelligence pushes us to think through, and these are, of course, philosophical as well as technological issues. And so that's where I hope to spend some time with you on today. I hope to actually get there today, but I'm going to take the long path. I'm going to talk a little bit about the right impasse in the negotiations with Iran. You may have heard, right, that Donald Trump told Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner not to go to Islamabad after Iran withdrew its foreign minister from Islamabad. So negotiations that appeared to be about to take place, indirect negotiations, by the way, not direct negotiations, but at least an effort for the two sides to begin again talking about how to resolve what seems to me to be fundamentally opposed positions on how to end the war. That was supposed to start maybe today, maybe tomorrow, and now it's not starting. The idea that the foreign minister of Iran had a written response to the Trump proposal, and so that there was going to at least be some clarity about how Iran was reacting. It appears now that the two sides are not going to speak anytime soon. And so the idea that I think what is informing this is not just that the positions of the two sides are miles apart. You know, Iran wants reparations for the damage caused to it and wants to be right out from under the sanction regime that it's been under since Trump withdrew from the uh, Obama era nuclear deal, and it wants its sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz to be announced. The United States wants Iran to renounce its uranium program, turn over its enriched uranium to us or to Russia, a third party, wants Iran to immediately open the Strait of Hormuz. And, you know, these are very hard to reconcile positions. One of the questions is this each side posturing with a maximalist position, or is it really the case that each side thinks it can prevail in imposing its preferred settlement on the other side? And I'm worried that it's looking more like the second. This is not just a negotiating posture. This really does reflect the fact that both sides think they won the war. And that's what I want to spend a little bit of time speaking with you about today, to try to figure out why it is that Donald Trump believes he won the war, and that the regime of Iran, which is in many respects in disarray, it's hard to know exactly where the decision-making center of that regime is right now. But nevertheless, it appears that those who are in power to influence these negotiations believe that they have the upper hand. So the American position, the position coming out of the White House, I think is quite easy to understand. We have succeeded in destroying large portions of the Iranian military, large portions of the military adjacent infrastructure of the country. Um, and we have, of course, decapitated and severely disorganized the regime, the governing regime of the Islamic Republic. And so we have the military upper hand. That is the position that I think informs some of the way in which Pete Hegseth celebrates the success of this campaign. And I don't think it's inaccurate in the narrow sense of not misrepresenting the facts on the ground. But I do think it might misunderstand the nature of the power base of the Iranian regime, which seems to be rooted not in its military or even its military adjacent infrastructure, but instead in its paramilitary, in the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and they do not appear to have been significantly damaged. Their access to their weapons may be diminished, but they still have sufficient weapons to repress their population. And if anything, they may have in fact been bolstered or strengthened in terms of their perceived legitimacy, or at least their begrudging support from the population, because now they appear to be the main barrier to something akin to American conquest or imperialism over Iran, and Iranians don't want that, right? And so that's a little bit about the American perspective, but then I need to add another layer, right? The Iranian economy was in tatters before this war, right? And so there's a protracted drought, there's runaway inflation with the currency, there is the long-term effect of the economic sanctions and the inability of Iran to sell its most precious resource at market value freely, its oil. And so the idea that the economic incompetence and mismanagement of the Islamic Republican government was really beginning to embolden the population to protest against the government, to turn against the government, um, is, I think, at the background of Trump and his administration's calculation, because, of course, they're blockading Iran. And in so doing, they're preventing the people of Iran from gaining access to the essential goods that Iran imports. And most of these imports do come by sea, do have to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. And right, the U.S. has a blockade on one side, the Iranians have a blockade on the other side. And so very little traffic goes either way at this point. And the idea that the pressure on Iran is being ratcheted up by the day as this blockade makes life more and more miserable, makes the economy more and more dysfunctional. I think that's the other consideration. And I think that this is not an invalid consideration. I do wonder how much pressure the Iranian regime feels. And so I've talked with you before about an autocracy fighting a democracy, and the way in which the autocracy in the short term has the advantage of not needing to be responsive to its people. In the medium to long term, of course, we don't know how strong an autocracy is, if there are fractures or vulnerabilities in the regime that perhaps are hard to see from the outside. But I do worry, frankly, about the decision making in the Trump administration, the wishful thinking, the magical thinking that seems to have given rise to this war in the first place. I see no reason to believe that it's been replaced with greater realism, with greater reality-based thinking in the right now. Getting close to the end of the second month of the war. So now let's shift for a moment to the Iranian perspective. And that's where I've got these diagrams that I've borrowed from Paul Krugman, I'm going to start with this, right? Brent oil price scenarios, and so I'll just for a moment try to explain a little bit what we're talking about here. The Brent oil per barrel price, BBL, right on this diagram, is a futures price, right? So this is a market that anticipates what the supply for the oil will be, what the demand for the oil will be, and sets a price for, right, what it thinks the oil is going to cost maybe a month from now. And because most of these transactions are, right, transactions for future delivery, that tends to be the price we pay most attention to. But I'll just point out very quickly, almost nobody actually uses a barrel of Brent crude oil. And so although the price right now is a little bit over a dollar a barrel, the price of diesel is a little bit over $150 a barrel if you buy it today, right? Not the futures, the literal cost of buying it today. The price of jet fuel is approaching $200 a barrel. You may have seen many European airlines are beginning to cancel large numbers of flights. And so we're not talking about a few flights, but 30, 40, 50% of their flights, because they believe that they're going to run out of jet fuel. And so or not be able to afford jet fuel at the price that works for them to be able to fill their planes. I actually am supposed to be in Europe presenting a paper a couple weeks from now, and I worry that I'm going to get over there and not be able to get back, or not be able to get back in a timely fashion. I'm actually reconsidering the trip, despite the fact that I really want to go to the conference and present the paper. Having said all of that, right, so we have a metric for judging the value of oil. It's not an actual cost of things that matter right now more, like how much diesel or jet fuel costs. And then we have, right, three scenarios: low disruption of the world's oil supply, medium disruption, and high disruption. And what this really refers to is how long the Strait of Hormuz will be closed and how long until the supply is able to recover once it's open. And so low disruption scenarios tend to assume that the strait is going to open any day now, and that the oil supply that the world needs will come back online within, say, a month. And by the way, the International Energy Association published a report just a day or two ago that indicated that they believe that the disruption may last 2 years, that it may take 2 years for the supply of oil that was present prior to the beginning of the war to be present again. And that is, I think, indicating that the low disruption scenario is not a real scenario, right? Medium disruption says, well, the Strait of Hormuz will be open within a month to 2 months from now. The high disruption scenario is the Strait of Hormuz is going to be closed 3 months or longer, right? And then there is on the other axis here the question about what the demand for oil is like. And so we speak in economics of elasticity. You can think here of the pair of pants with an elastic waistband. And so you gain a little bit of weight, the pants still fit. You lose a little bit of weight, the pants still fit. You don't got to buy new pairs of pants every time your waist grows or shrinks. And the idea with prices is that demand goes up as prices go down, demand goes down as prices go up. That's elasticity of demand depending upon price. And in a high elasticity market, people are very sensitive to the price. You really like your Scotch whiskey and you're willing to pay $50 a bottle for it. But if the price goes up to $100 a bottle, no, thank you. I'll drink tequila or just sober up, right? But when it comes to a good you really need, the classic example here is eggs and so-called eggflation over the last 5 years between COVID and avian flu, and the idea that you can't really do without eggs. You can't bake, you can't have your breakfast. And so people tend to be much less elastic in their consumption of eggs. If egg prices go up, people spend more money, but then they have less money, and then maybe they spend less on something else, or else they're pinched. They don't know how to make ends meet. And so the question is the demand for oil highly elastic, in the middle, or low in elasticity? And here I think we don't fully know the answer to this question. We are much less reliant on oil than we were in the 1970s. 90% plus of our GDP was dependent upon, in one way or another, burning fossil fuels, and maybe we're down to like 60% now. But having said that, we're seeing two contradictory things happening at the same time. Countries trying to limit their use of oil. And so the airlines would be one example of this. In Pakistan and Malaysia, college students being told, don't come to school. We'll do all of our education over Zoom because that way you don't have to drive or take buses and we can stop burning as much oil. We're seeing, I think it's in Taiwan and Singapore, people being told not to wear their jackets to work, right? Take your jacket off and don't be formal, because then we can use less air conditioning and then we'll have to burn less natural gas to run our power plants. Those are examples of right, decreased consumption as prices increase. But we're also seeing something else, right, which is the many countries are reducing gas taxes, are trying to subsidize the cost of gas, are putting price caps on gas. And the issue here is that modern economies run on fossil fuel, right? And so if the price of fossil fuel goes up across the board, the price of almost everything else goes up across the board. And the result is that people have less money to spend, and then economic activity goes down, and you're potentially in a recession, or even worse, potentially in stagflation, where prices are going up, but economic activity is going down. And the governments desperately want to avoid that scenario. And note, right, what they're doing, therefore, is trying to drive the cost of the consumer's purchase of fossil fuel and things related to it down. But the actual cost of fossil fuel on the market is going up, right? In terms of what the suppliers of it have to pay, what the government has to pay or has to subsidize. And so in a sense, they're actually increasing demand or preventing the market from being as elastic as it might be, the prices going up and people dropping their consumption. And so if, right, we're in a medium or high disruption scenario, and if governments can't afford to perpetually subsidize consumption of fossil fuel, then pretty soon this strategy is going to backfire. And it's going to backfire because it will have artificially increased or maintained demand for something that is really going to be scarce. There's 20% less of it, 30% less of it than there was 2 months ago, right? And so when we look at the medium elasticity, low elasticity, medium disruption, high disruption scenarios, we see the price of a barrel of Brent crude oil going up between, right, somewhere to the neighborhood of $150 to $370 a barrel. And I hope it's clear, right? Before this war started, the price was moving in the $60 to $70 per barrel range. Right now, it's at $100 a barrel, and that's causing a lot of alarm, a lot of worry about inflation and recession. If it goes up another 50% to more than double where it was, if it goes up astronomically to, right, $300 a barrel more than it was trading before the war, right? You know, a 5-6-fold increase in the cost of fossil fuel. Well, it's going to dwarf what happened in the 1970s, right? And remember that in the 1970s, there was a 7% decrease in the supply of fossil fuel to certain countries as a result of the OPEC embargo. And the result is, right, that instead of oil consumption doing what it had done for the previous decades, it actually tailed off and maybe went into actual decline. And similarly with economic activity, whereas, right, economic growth had been growing quite steadily, it diminished in terms of its annual rate as a result of the increased cost of oil and the decreased use of oil. And so the idea now to come back to Iran believes it has a super weapon. It has an economic weapon that exceeds the power of the West's economic weapon. That this scenario threatens the entire global economy, and that ultimately the pressure will be unbearable for America and Donald Trump, and they will have to accede to some of Iran's demands. At least it seems to me that that's the underlying analysis, and this then goes to, right, a more detailed analysis of the kind of economic vulnerability that the West, and in particular the United States, has. And so I should have put on this diagram. There just wasn't room for it, but it's a graph I've shown you before many times, and it shows, excuse me, the price of goods and services, essential goods and services that are made or delivered in the United States, and the price of goods and services that are outsourced to China or elsewhere in the world. And of course, the inflation with the stuff made in the United States over something like the last 20 years has been somewhere around 60%, right? It's been increasing in price. Some of this stuff, childcare, healthcare, education, has been increasing in price, 100%, 200% really rapidly. Whereas the stuff that can be outsourced is much cheaper, right? Or at least the rate of inflation has been very even, or even the price has gone down. And so the idea that we're compensating for some of the stuff that's domestic, that's really expensive, by the more of the greater affordability of the stuff that's being imported is part of the backdrop to, I think, what's going on in the United States in 2026. This last week, we got the consumer sentiment rating from the University of Michigan, right? And I hope you can see that on the diagram. It is the worst rating in 50 years, maybe the worst rating ever, right? Worse than 2008 in the trough of the Great Recession, worse than 2020 when COVID was rocking the world economy. And there is something peculiar going on here, right? Krugman produced this data, and I think this is really quite illuminating. This is a diagram that on the right x-axis has, on the horizontal axis, misery index, right? That's inflation plus unemployment. And I don't know if you remember, Ronald Reagan trumpeted this in the 1980 campaign against Jimmy Carter. The misery index is very high. And I think you can see, is 1980 on the diagram? No, it doesn't go back that far, but 1990, very high misery index. 2011, very high misery index. 2022, very high misery index. And as the I'm sorry. So as the misery index increases, consumer sentiment sinks, right? That's what you would expect. And on the other hand, as unemployment goes down, as inflation goes down, consumer sentiment tends to go up. So these two things, right, tend to be co-dependent or co-variable. They tend to vary with each other. But look at 2023, 2024, 2025, 2026, right? Very low, generally speaking, on the misery index, but very low consumer sentiment too. And so this comes to a question we've talked about recently and at length. Why are Americans so dissatisfied with their economy? And I'm not going to reprise the whole discussion. The idea that we're not optimistic about the future, that we're not satisfied with our current lives, that our well-being is really slumping, and that although we do have higher prices, it doesn't seem like higher prices by themselves are sufficient to account for this. But I will add very quickly that one of the things that changed most dramatically in the March consumer sentiment data that just got published is the expectation of inflation, right? Americans now expect that inflation in 2026 will be about 4.8%, very high, right? And so the idea that we're looking at this war, looking at what it's doing to oil prices, saying oil prices affect the price of everything else, and that we were already dissatisfied with our economy. This is, I think, part of what Iran understands in the background of their now weaponized interdependence war with the United States. We're trying to cut off their trade. They're trying to cut off our oil, which is going to be more damaging. And then we add the final variable here, which is that we are approaching national elections. And I'm just going to bring you up to speed. Donald Trump's approval rating is at an all-time low, as bad as it was in his first term after he had lost the election to Joe Biden and after the January 6th insurrection or invasion of the Capitol and the widespread perception that Donald Trump had both incited the crowd and failed to react appropriately when they breached Congress. And so the idea that he is as unpopular, right, in 2026, when none of that stuff is going on, as he was, right, in the aftermath of the invasion of Congress. This is an abysmal data point for Donald Trump. And the idea that it seems to be driven by the tremendous unpopularity of the war and the perceived economic implications of the war, that it's dragging Trump and the Republicans down, that there is a significant advantage in terms of, do you prefer the Democrats or the Republicans? Please note that for the first time since 2010, Americans say that Democrats are better for the economy than the Republicans are. It seems clear that the Democrats are favored, given the current political climate, to regain control of the House of Representatives. And by the way, for really the first time in a long time, it looks like in 2026 there might just be a plausible path for the Democrats to regain control of the Senate. It's still a slim and difficult course path for them to negotiate. It looks like right now the Republicans are still favored to control 50 seats in the Senate, and with J.D. Vance, the tiebreaker, that would give them control of the Senate. But at least there's now a chance that Democrats might win in Maine or Alaska or some of the other places, Ohio, that previously I think most people had thought were out of reach for the Democrats. And so again, I think Iran is thinking, well, these elections are coming up quickly. The more we turn the screws on the American economy, the more likely it is that Donald Trump ultimately caves, because we know that Donald Trump doesn't want Democratic control over Congress because he will be investigated. It's likely that evidence of corruption and crime will come to light, and then he'll be impeached. And this is the do-over presidency. Donald Trump wanted the second term of his presidency to be much more successful than the first term, and then for him not to have to suffer the humiliation of being impeached. So I'm going to stop there for a second. I know I went on for longer than I should, but I am thinking about this stuff, and I wanted to share this information with you. I will note very quickly, right, that the Democrats, won the referendum in Virginia, and so they're now absent a court case that prevents them going to be able to redistrict. And so it now appears that, right, the redistricting battle is a standstill or even slight advantage to Democrats at the moment. I think we should be careful about celebrating this. We should not be doing redistricting in the middle of a decade. That's not the way the Constitution is designed, right? The real loser in the redistricting battles is the responsiveness of the actual Congress, right? This is the parties basically gerrymandering so that they are the victors, not the people who they represent. That's a problem, but nevertheless, it's a problem for Donald Trump and the Republican Party as well in 2026. It looks like the Department of Homeland Security is starting to run out of money, and the Congress is having a really hard time deciding how to refinance it. And of course, if they can't fund ICE, they can't do their deportation agenda as efficiently. And so there are all kinds of signs that there is mounting pressure on Donald Trump, and that Iran understands this, and that this is relevant to the fact that they're not in a big hurry to capitulate or to concede our demands, that they think they can actually prevail in negotiations for peace. We will have to see. But that's the analysis I wanted to share with you. Happy to take your thoughts or questions for a moment before, and I don't want this to happen a second week in a row. Let's get to the discussion of artificial intelligence as well. Any thoughts, any questions, any things you want to raise? Off we go. Oh, Flossie, go ahead, but you have to unmute yourself. There you had it for a second. There you go. Go. Flossie, go. Okay, now you got it.
A great poem by William Butler Yeats at the time of the Irish Rebellion, roundabout in the 1950s or thereabout. And he sees all the trouble that is happening, and he sees the martyrdom of the Irish people and the cruelty.
Flossie, go ahead. You're muted now. Flossie, you're going in and out. You need to hold that button down the whole time, I think. Flossie, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Hold that button down firmly.
I'm pointing to the great poem about the Irish Rebellion in the middle of the 20th century. William Butler Yeats wrote a poem about the Irish dying for the cause, being hanged for the cause, suffering for the cause, and sometimes betraying their own desire to be free. And out of it emerges what he called a strange beauty, the Irish coming into their own, understanding who they are and what they are, suffering for what they have to give up, and sometimes betraying themselves, but also finding out that they are a people. I don't give you an A equals B here, but what we are seeing is a hard time, but out of that hard time, coming to a new realization of who we are and what we mean and what we feel we were meant to be. So there's another intelligence coming out, another feeling, and that may be somehow related to what art always sees, that there are two sides. They appear to be opposite, but they merge and a new kind of child appears. That's my hope, that there is an underlying change awaiting us, and we're finding ourselves as a different kind of America and a different kind of American. And if we have that and believe in it, we can somehow defeat what Trump stands for and understand that there's something about him that is not what we call America. Then what the hell is it? We find a name for it, and in that name we can defeat him.
Thank you, Flossie. And I'm going to start by noting that this is the last Saturday in Poetry Month, right? April is Poetry Month, and so I appreciate you bringing Yeats. I want to say I think Easter 1916 is the poem you're referring to, but I'm not positive. But the definition of poetry Robert Frost gave, which I'm probably going to bungle, but that it's a momentary reprieve from confusion, right? The poetry sometimes produces insight that our hard-headed political analysis can't. And so then let me come to the substance of what you said, Flossie. Sometimes a people has to suffer for a long time in order to learn, right? And that maybe we needed to suffer through 2 terms of Donald Trump to really put the lie to the populist promise. And I do think that part of what is happening in 2026 is the American people are saying, look, this guy said that as soon as he was elected, prices would come down. As soon as he was elected, utility bills would drop in half. As soon as he was elected, the price of gas would come down. And lo and behold, he's done a whole bunch of stuff, tariffs and war in particular, as well as eliminating, right, Obamacare, healthcare subsidies that are increasing the costs for everyone, and especially for the most vulnerable against us. And so when, in the aftermath of the Virginia referendum, he says this is just voting fraud, they stole the election, I think that comes across as incredibly stale and tired. The boy who cried wolf, right? Here's Donald Trump just going through the motions again, and he's just lost credibility. So I hope you're right about that. And I would note, right, that Tucker Carlson, out of all people, is now apologizing to the American people for having supported Donald Trump. By the way, doing so in ways that are also deeply anti-Israeli and borderline anti-Semitic. And so we should be careful, not to miss the undertone of Carlson's apology. But having said that, I'll be really brief about this. I don't think Donald Trump is the disease. I think Donald Trump is the symptom in ways that we've talked about in the past. I think what gives rise to right-wing populism throughout the democratic world is not merely the rise of charismatic leaders, but it's the failure of our institutions to deliver the good to the people who are electing the leaders, the breakdown of political parties and the way in which they've become empty vehicles for populist or charismatic leaders, the fragmentation of our media system. I could keep going, right? But these are structural problems that transcend the particular politicians who ride the discontent, the fracturing or fragmentation, the credence or the willingness to believe conspiracy theory to power, right? And so part of the reason I point to the undertone of Tucker Carlson's apology is to point out that at the same time Carlson seems to be withdrawing his support from Trump, he seems also to be seeding a new conspiracy theory, and I suspect vying for the leadership of the MAGA movement or the next iteration of right-wing populism in the United States. I don't think it's over, even if Donald Trump is discredited. What we really need to learn is not just that Donald Trump is a liar and not to be trusted, but also that his brand of politics does not deliver the goods, and that we need to actually work on a brand of politics that does deliver the goods. But once again, nearly done. You want me to talk for 10 minutes about artificial intelligence, at least about the stories in the news that have my attention right now? How about it? I know we'll go over a little bit, but hopefully none of us has opera tickets for this afternoon. So here are some stories, old and new, right? And so I'm just going to point very quickly to young graduates face the grimmest job market in years, and note that the last week saw both Meta and Google announce 10% and 7% job cuts, right, across the board, because they want to concentrate on buying more AI, right? And the idea that for many companies now, their AI budget rivals their employee budget, right? They're spending almost as much on artificial intelligence as they are in human beings. This is just going to keep getting worse. And then there's the irony, of course, which is you remember Karl Marx in the Communist Manifesto, saying that the thing that the bourgeoisie produces above all else is its own gravediggers, right? It's producing the proletariat who's ultimately going to fight against it. Well, in Meta and Google, the thing that the coders produced is their own replacement, right? AI that now codes better than they do, right? And so the description of an anthropic coder who now doesn't do any computer coding, doesn't write any programs himself. What he does is supervise a team of 20 artificial intelligence systems, 20 versions of Claude that are writing the code, right? So we're getting into this world where AI is really taking over some of our jobs. It's really coming home. But what I want to really focus on is that both Anthropic and OpenAI released new versions, new systems this week. And in particular, Anthropic's Mythos system, which has been released only to the US and the British government and about 40 corporations. The British have both a technology minister in their government and a technology security agency in their government. And they find that it's about 10 times more powerful than anything else available in the realm of artificial intelligence. And so this is a big step up in the power of artificial intelligence. And the reason that Anthropic did not release this generally to the public is because it is so good at identifying security loopholes, flaws, bugs, that if it is used by hackers, by cyber criminals, by cyber warriors, it's going to immediately create immense vulnerabilities in government agencies, in banks, in air traffic control systems, in the kinds of computational systems everybody is using all the time these days. And so Anthropic gave it to the United States and Britain and Microsoft and Google and Apple so that they could see where the holes in their security systems for their technology are and begin patching them before the bad guys find out where they are. I think you're familiar with this, but the idea that cyber crime, cyber terrorism, cyber war are now, right, among the most dangerous developments in the realm of security in the world. That it's very typical these days for a hospital to be subject to a ransomware attack, so-called. What makes it ransomware is the hackers, right? They might be in Russia, paid by the Russian government, or perhaps working for a Russian criminal cartel, but they might be in North Korea, they might be in China, they might be in Iran, or they might be in Hungary, right? You know, they could be anywhere in the world. They could be part of a government-sponsored farm of cyber hackers, or they could be just part of a criminal enterprise, or they could be an individual trying to enrich themselves. They install malware, right? A kind of computer virus that attacks, say, the patient electronic medical record management system at the hospital and shuts it down, right? And then the hospital doesn't have access to the records it needs. Who's getting surgery today and tomorrow? Who needs what kind of medication? Who's in what room, right? And the hackers say, give us $100 million and we will give you back control over your computer system. And typically, the advice from the security experts is you might have to pay them, right? Because we can't unlock your system fast enough to save the lives of the patients in your hospital. And so you can imagine a scenario in which they do this with the flight control systems in the United States, and think about how quickly we would pay a lot of money to be able to unlock those systems. And what Anthropic's new AI model shows is where all those vulnerabilities are much more quickly and thoroughly than any AI system has before. And so, as the headline says, right, there's emergency responses from central banks and intelligence agencies globally to the idea that this new technology exists. And please note, at the same time, right, this is, I think, Monday of this week, later in the week, OpenAI releases ChatGPT 5.5, but also their new coding program. And again, with the coding program, they give it to maybe 100 companies and a few more governments. But again, they're saying it's too powerful to be released to the public. And I'll just say this very quickly. Once 40 companies or 100 companies have this technology, it's not going to be terribly long until it leaks out, right? Has China or Russia already compromised someone within one of those companies who is going to share at least relevant data with them? They've got hundreds of millions of dollars to spend to be able to ultimately capture this technology. It's going to get out whether or not OpenAI or Anthropic wants it to get out. One last headline I'm going to call your attention to for just a moment. And this is from Wired. I'm sorry, it kind of bled into the story above it. Anthropic opposes the extreme AI liability bill that OpenAI backed. And so this is in Illinois. It's SB 4444, I think is the, I'm not positive I've got the bill number right, but I think that's it. But the bill is a bill that OpenAI has participated in the drafting of and is lobbying for, and it says basically that the artificial intelligence company is not liable in events where its technology either causes or is used by someone who causes a mass casualty event, defined as an event where 100 or more people die, or an economic disaster, defined as an event where $100 billion or more is lost. Say you hack a bank or hack a stock market using this technology, or a catastrophic event, say a train wreck where toxic chemicals are spilled, caused by AI, unless, right, the AI company is recklessly negligent and hasn't, right, published appropriate safety documentation. And this is a very, very, very low bar in American law, right? So very easy for the AI company to shed liability for a potential catastrophe, mass casualty, or hugely catastrophic environmentally or financially event. And OpenAI is basically saying, yeah, we don't want to be on the hook if our technology does something terrible. And Anthropic, to its credit, is saying, actually, we don't favor this bill. We oppose this bill. This is why AI companies need to be more careful, need to try to incorporate ethics into their systems, into their platforms, and to actually monitor what's being done with their systems, right? And we'll see in weeks to come, OpenAI's ChatGPT has counseled mass shooters in, right, what kind of weapon to use, what kind of bullet to use, when to attack. It's counseled people to commit suicide, right? It has some features that appear to create these kinds of liabilities. We talked a little bit about the big tech lawsuits a couple of weeks ago. I'll just note, right, this is not Anthropic and OpenAI alone, right? Big tech lobbying to halt social media bans. This is happening again and again. It's much easier to tailor legislation to your advantage if you're making hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars in profit, as these companies are, or to block the legislation that potentially regulates you. And so I'll just leave it there. I know we went over, but I did want you to see. I do think that this really is right. A really important acceleration in the power of this technology, the kind of thing that people have been warning for 5 or 10 years would eventually happen, maybe happened last week. And again, what you tell me, had you paid attention? Had this story come to your attention last week? Yeah, I'm seeing mainly no's, maybe one or two yeses. I do think we neglect this stuff to our peril. And so it's part of the reason, despite getting carried away talking about Iran and the US and the economic weaponization of the Strait of Hormuz, I did want to spend a little bit of time talking about what's happening with this technology as well. Third time's the charm. Hopefully next week there will be an opportunity to talk about the different kinds of intelligence and why it seems to me that the kind of intelligence humans have is not yet present in machines. Any final questions or thoughts before we call it a day? It's always a pleasure to be with you guys. Take care. Thank
Thank
you
you.
for the opportunity to have this discussion with you. Looking forward to continuing it. Be well, everyone. See you next week.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank you,
guys.
David.